Philip Paxson drove home on a rainy night in North Carolina. Following the blue line on his phone screen, he steered his pickup truck off the edge of a bridge that had collapsed nearly a decade earlier. He drowned in the river below. This scenario repeats itself all over the world. People drive rental cars into oceans, strand themselves in remote deserts, and steer into oncoming traffic. In eastern Russia, two 18-year-olds attempted to drive across Siberia. To save a few hours, they followed a route suggested by Google Maps. It directed them onto an abandoned, unmaintained stretch of a Soviet-era highway. One froze to death, the other survived with severe frostbite. These are perfectly rational adults, yet they ignored the physical hazards directly outside their windshields to follow a set of digital instructions. Researchers refer to this as death by GPS. These tragedies occur when our psychological willingness to trust technology collides with invisible flaws in the digital environment. To understand exactly how often this happens, researchers at Northwestern University compiled a corpus of 158 distinct catastrophic incidents tied to personal navigation technologies. Typically, single-vehicle collisions make up 15% of all U.S. traffic crashes, but when researchers isolate crashes associated with GPS devices, the data looks entirely different. The rate spikes to 57% as drivers steer into walls, broken bridges, and active train tracks. These figures reveal a pattern far more pervasive than individual error. When drivers across different continents make the same lethal mistakes, we are seeing a systemic breakdown between the satellite data, the routing code, and the human brain. The failure begins with a misunderstanding of the hardware. The Global Positioning System satellites orbiting the Earth have no idea where the roads actually are. They only calculate your phone's coordinates. The map itself is a static file downloaded to your device or streamed from a server. Like any digital file, it suffers from data decay. It rots over time if it isn't constantly updated to reflect changes in the real world. The Russian teenagers were routed onto a road that hadn't been maintained in decades. The map showed a clean line, but physical reality consisted of icy, treacherous terrain that destroyed their vehicle's radiator. This decay also applies to socio-political hazards. In Brazil, tourists have been repeatedly directed by mapping apps into volatile favelas. The software registers the geometry of the paved streets, but it completely fails to label the dense, unpredictable geography as a risk zone for armed violence. When the foundational map data is outdated or blind to context, every instruction the app generates is built on a lethal illusion. The second link in the chain is the algorithm. When you enter a destination, the software simply calculates the shortest or fastest mathematical path across a network of nodes. Algorithms are highly efficient at math, but they lack environmental context. They cannot see that a road is blocked by a blizzard, and they do not distinguish a safe paved highway from a muddy logging trail. In one documented case, an algorithm instructed a driver to turn right, failing to distinguish between the asphalt on-ramp and the railroad tracks running immediately parallel to the road. The driver turned onto the tracks and was struck by an oncoming train. The algorithm optimizes for a frictionless, abstract grid. When applied to the unpredictable, three-dimensional world, that mathematical efficiency turns into a fatal hazard. But this leaves a massive question. If a road is unpaved or a bridge is missing, why doesn't the human behind the wheel hit the brakes and turn around? Psychologists identify this behavior as automation bias. When we interact with machines that we perceive as highly accurate and authoritative, we naturally outsource our critical thinking to them. We slip into a state of passive navigation. Instead of scanning the environment and reading signs through the windshield, we stare blankly, listening to audio prompts and waiting to be told what to do next. Active navigation requires heavy cognitive lifting. A famous neuroscience study of London taxi drivers, who must memorize thousands of complex city streets to earn their licenses, shows how demanding this process is. The physical structure of these drivers' brains adapted. Their hippocampi, the region associated with spatial memory, actually enlarged. When we rely entirely on an app, we let those spatial mapping skills atrophy. We lose our spatial awareness and our ability to judge immediate environmental context. This cognitive surrender completes the chain of failure, allowing bad data and blind algorithms to result in physical tragedy. When this chain of failure leads to a death, the legal system struggles to assign responsibility. Who is to blame when outdated data, abstract code, and human psychology fail simultaneously? Courts must navigate a labyrinth of liability laws. Tech companies argue that their apps fall under product liability as mere conveniences, not authoritative guides. By defining the app as a casual tool, they place the final burden of safety entirely on the driver. Because of this legal ambiguity, mapping platforms rarely face immediate consequences for dangerous routing. Lethal digital traps often remain in the software for years, usually only getting patched after a fatal accident forces a high-profile lawsuit. Navigation tools must eventually incorporate dynamic risk warnings to keep users safe, but waiting for a software update is a dangerous strategy. Surviving the era of automated navigation requires active resistance. We have to rebuild our internal cognitive maps, question the blue line on the screen, and trust our own eyes above the algorithm.